Welcome to Founders, a podcast exploring the countries of the world by learning about the lives of their founders. Episode 1, Albania. Hello, I'm Matthew Grace, your host, and welcome to today's episode on Albania. This is our first episode, and I'm excited to get started. Albania is a country in southeastern Europe, an area called the Balkans. If you know about the early Roman Empire, Albania was in the area called Illyria and Epirus. If you're not too familiar with that, then you probably at least know Italy and Greece. It's kind of in between those two geographically. The western border of Albania is the Adriatic Sea, the sliver of water just on the right of Italy's boot. And Albania is the closest location to Italy on the eastern side of that sea. On the northern and eastern sides of Albania, you'll find mountains. So many mountains. In lower central and southern Albania, you'll find flatter territory. Depending on where you are in Albania, the average summer temperatures could be anywhere between 30 degrees Fahrenheit and 71 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're from the States, you could probably think about this as something similar to the West Coast. Beaches and moderate climates to the left, and mountains and cold to the right. Except in a much smaller package. It's about the size of Maryland. Now, of course, we're not here to talk about geography. We're here to talk about founders, but we at least want to be able to imagine where we're at. The founder that we're going to talk about today in Albania has parks named after him, monuments to him, fields, universities, museums, all named after him. There's even a mountain that bears his name. And if you go to Rome, you can find a palace with his name on it. To figure out why, we need to venture way back to the 1400s. Albania was not a country as we would see it. It had been ruled by first the Romans, and then the Eastern Romans, what we usually call the Byzantines, from the 2nd century BC all the way up to the 14th century AD. But by this time, they'd kind of become small principalities that were loosely affiliated with the Byzantines. These became vassals in the 1430s of the up-and-coming Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire that would rule the majority of the Mediterranean for the better part of 600 years. At this time in history, when a people were defeated or became vassals, what did that mean? Well, basically, instead of being absorbed into the empire, they were forced into an alliance where they promised to do what the boss wanted and pay the boss some money. If you think about, anything you know about gangster movies or anything like that, that's basically what's going on here. They're paying for protection, and they have to make sure that they pay on time or the boss gets upset. And they have to make sure to obey the boss or the boss gets upset. And what happened when the boss got upset in a vassal relationship at this time was that the nobles or the aristocracy usually had to send their sons to the boss empire to ensure that they would comply in the future. Well, I can tell you the Albanians were very independence-minded. I did mention that they were loose principalities, but it was more like clans, basically. They had these families who had built up money enough to own lots of land, and people would work their land. So really, they were very independent, and there were lots of people who lived in the mountains who just basically had no overlord at all. So very quickly, they were sending hostages to the Ottomans. One of these hostages was named George Castriati, but for our purposes, we're going to call him by his more famous name, Scanderbeg, which means Lord Alexander. He and others like him would be educated by the Ottomans in how to fight and lead in an Ottoman army. And that's what they would do. Now, there is a recent book out that says that he wasn't really a hostage, and they have some evidence about it, but it's really unclear. And a lot of the historical evidence still shows that he was a hostage, and every Albanian pretty much knows that he was a hostage. And that's really what we're focusing on, is what people think about these founders. So we're definitely going to stick with the traditional story here that still has strong historic backing. Anyways, that's what Scanderbeg did growing up, and he seemed to be a loyal subject until one day in 1444 when the Ottoman army he was a part of was defeated, and he fled with some other Albanians back to Albania. He promptly obtained a forged document saying he was to be the commander of the most important fortification in Albania, Kruje, and from there he really had a commanding view and power over the smaller areas around him. So he was able to take some forts in the area. He raised his family crest over Kruje. That would become the Albanian national flag later on. And he declared independence with a stirring speech that I think is worth listening to. It's not overly long. Here it is as quoted by A.K. Brakob in his Scanderbeg biography.
We will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
Sorry, I got too excited. Let me get the real one here. It is not I who has given you this nation and superiority. It is not I who has given you this city. It is you who have given them unto me. It was not I who put arms into your hands. I found you ready in arms. I found you everywhere, bearing the signs of liberty in your hearts, your faces, your swords, and your lances. And as most loyal teachers and guardians ordained by my Father, you have put the scepter in my hands with no less faith and diligence than as if you had kept and preserved it every day, especially for me. And you have brought me by your effort and careful care into my ancestral possession without shedding any blood. Now, therefore, in the name of God, lead on and conduct me into the recovery of the rest of our country, which yet remains in the hands and possession of the enemy. The greatest part, and in a manner the whole task, you have already accomplished. Kruje is recovered, and this territory therefore is wholly under our care. We are all united as one, the name of the enemy banished from this part of our country. Only the towns and strongholds are still in enemy hands. Let us then march on and advance our standards speedily. Let us take unto us the courage of victors. Fortune shall favor our endeavors. Soon after, there was a meeting of the Albanian nobles, and the League of Legge was agreed to as a path to resist the Ottomans. This was originally supposed to be a kind of League of Equals, but Scanderbeg was always viewed as the leader, and he was convinced that Albania needed to move away from these loosely affiliated tribal principalities that fought with each other almost as much as they fought with the Ottomans, to a more centralized modern type state, which at this time was a kingdom. He set to work on that front, trying to consolidate as much power as he could into a centralized system that he was sure was the only way to get the resources needed to combat the Ottomans. Now, how he went about this, of course, was not to tell the aristocracy he wanted to do this and try to get them on board, because he was going to be taking power away from them. So he did what many a ruler did before him, and he got the people on his side. How did he do that? Well, one of the ways he did it was by not allowing more than one man to be drafted from each household, so as not to cripple regular families. He also dressed in normal clothes, ate regular food that the soldiers would eat, and just in general acted like a normal person. This is a very important part of the story, because instead of the people seeing him as some overlord, he was seen as one of them, and so when loyalty was needed later to ensure victory, he would find it. Now, let's get on to the stuff that made him a legend, which was the fighting. We're just going to do a quick flyby of these battles, because we don't want to be here for 3 hours, I don't think, and I frankly can't write that much. So, the first battle came soon after the events we talked about in the last few minutes. The Ottomans came at Albania with a force of around 30 to 40,000 troops. This first battle happened at Torvial in 1444. The Albanians were heavily outnumbered. They got word of the approaching force early on, and Scanderbeg was able to choose the location for the fight, and he chose it based on its tight confines, hoping to minimize the number of enemy who could actually come forward at the same time. Before the battle, he lined up his cavalry on the extreme left and right of the field where they couldn't be seen, and he would use these to execute a kind of delayed double envelopment. When the enemy came forward to engage his main army, the cavalry on the right side swooped down onto the back of their lines. Now the Ottomans had a lot of reserves because they had just been squished in this little valley, so they were able to pretty well stop this attack. But as their reserves faced this attack coming from the right, the cavalry hidden on the left came down and swooped down to the back of those reserves. And in so doing, they were able to really slaughter the reserves and then quickly turn and hit the main line from the back. Well, you can probably guess how that went. All of the Ottomans either died or fled. The next battle was at Makra in 1445. It was against a smaller army of around 9,000 troops. It was sent really just to play defense and keep the Albanians from expanding. But it seems like the general wanted to take some initiative and destroy the Albanians himself. Scanderbeg quickly found out about this and used his army and their knowledge of the terrain in the area to find a perfect ambush site. And of course he ambushed them and they routed. The third battle involved a larger force of around 15,000 cavalry sent to raid Albania. It was meant to burn and pillage the area, but not really to engage with an army. The commander of that force split up his forces, with one group doing the burning and another guarding their supplies at a fortified position. Scanderbeg's forces found out about this and snuck around to the fortified position, which was not expecting an attack. And you guessed it, they attacked. The camp was overwhelmed, and 5,000 Ottomans were said to have died, along with all their supplies being snatched up by the Albanians. This sudden reversal of fortune caused the Ottoman army to fall back in panic. By now you may be thinking, he sure does know a lot. Well, yes, he does. He was committed to the principle of information dominance. He wanted to know what was going on before the enemy knew what was going on, seemingly. It seems like during his time as an Ottoman hostage, fighting in these battles with the Ottomans, he had made a lot of friends, and he used those friends as basically his own personal spy network, so that any time the Ottomans were approaching, long before they arrived, he knew they were coming. Not only did he have these spies in the enemy's ranks, but he also set up a very well-coordinated warning system inside of Albania, so that if there ever was some sort of surprise attack, he would quickly be able to get the information to his army. This perpetual state of information dominance and their strong understanding of the terrain that they were fighting on in Albania combined very well with his ability to exploit that knowledge. And these were really the keys to Scanderbeg's success against these larger and stronger armies. Now, up to this point, the Albanians have kind of faced regional Ottoman armies. The Ottoman Empire was really broken up into two types of groups. There were these overlords or governors of regions that would have their own small armies that were kind of second-tier troops. And then there was the Ottoman Sultan, who had kind of the cream of the crop in his army. Well, in this fourth battle, in 1448, there was a force of around 80,000 led by the Sultan, Murad II. Like I said earlier, this was the cream of the crop. So this wasn't going to be as easy as the other battles. He decided to attack a fortress at Svetigrad in eastern Albania. Now, if you remember what we talked about earlier, north and eastern Albania were just a whole bunch of mountains, and there were very few passes through those mountains that armies could go through. So the Albanians had fortified every one of those passes so that the only way the Ottomans could get in would be to come in from the south, which took a lot more time. So Murad II has decided that he wants to take one of these forts at this place called Svetigrad. He was unable to take it successfully at first because of the prime position had been built on. There was just no way he was going to be able to storm the castle or break down its walls. Eventually, he was able to induce the surrender of the fortress after cutting off their water supply, but by that point, Scanderbeg had been able to ambush his forces enough to cause some pretty significant casualties. It's thought that they lost around 20,000 of their 80,000 troops during this battle. Having said that, they did take the fortress, and I'm sure Murad II was more than happy with that, because this opened up a way into Albania from the east. And that's going to save a lot of time whenever they need to come in later and put down more revolts. So this was definitely a step back for the Albanians and Scanderbeg, but it did come at a pretty heavy cost for Murad II. After this, the Ottomans continued launching attack after attack, and Scanderbeg and the Albanians managed to go almost undefeated. They would almost never engage in a regular pitched battle because of constantly being outnumbered, but they were able to defeat all of these armies that the Ottomans sent pretty much. I did a count on it, and it seems that there were around 22 large-scale battles between the Albanians and the Ottomans over this 25-year period where Scanderbeg was leading his army. There were a total of around 600,000 combined Ottomans involved in all this. And they fought these Ottomans with forces that were perpetually at least twice as small as his opponents. His most famous battle came in 1457. It was the Battle of Albulena, where he faced off against Albanian Ottoman generals, leading two armies totaling around 50 to 80,000 soldiers altogether. This large advantage in numbers, combined with the enemy generals actually knowing the countryside, forced Scanderbeg to rethink his normal ambush plans. He instead settled for a long con, trusting that his loyalty of his soldiers would be stronger than these Ottomans would. He basically went to his generals and told them to march out in seemingly random directions and hide in the mountains around Albania, and not to come down, not to engage in any fighting for any reason until a signal was given. While the Ottoman generals were very confused by this, trying to figure out where Scanderbeg was, but they'd also heard about all these terrible things happening to Ottoman armies coming into Albania, so they were not willing to accomplish their mission while Scanderbeg's army was missing. Their mission at that time was to siege Kruje, that most crucial of fortifications in Albania, and take it. Well, they looked around for Scanderbeg's army, couldn't find it, and basically sat there waiting for him to come out for a long time. Now, because of the loyalty that Scanderbeg commanded from his kind of acting like he was the people and helping the people consistently, the people were not willing to give up his position. So he was able to stay hidden. His forces were able to stay hidden. Everybody just acted like, oh, he must have gone. Slowly, the Ottoman armies began to lose their discipline, as they had not seen any enemy soldiers for almost 6 months. When they had reached Scanderbeg's desired lackadaisicalness, he gave the signal to reassemble the army and launched a 3-pronged surprise assault on one of the camps. Now, the Ottoman force here outnumbered the Albanians, it said, by at least 4-1, and many estimates say 10-1. But because they had caught them by surprise, and they had caught a smaller camp, still with, some say, half of the enemy army in it, the ferociousness of this assault terrified the Ottomans, and they were quickly surrounded, and then the Albanians were able to either capture or kill half of this 80,000-man army, including one of their leaders. This was just a huge, epic victory for the Albanians over a force that was just massively larger than theirs. He continued to do this kind of stuff to the Ottomans for the rest of his life, until he finally caught malaria and died from it in 1468 at age 62. He had been leading this stubborn defense of his homeland since 1443, 25 years before. He'd fought off 2 different sultans, both Murad II and his son Mehmed II. And during all of this, he had been given some aid by European nations and the Pope, but not much. He at one point had signed a peace treaty with the Ottomans, only to be pushed into a crusade. Now, that would have been great for him if the crusade had happened, but the crusade fell apart in Italy after the Pope died, and he was left there again, fighting the Ottomans by himself. So this was always kind of a battle for survival for the Albanians, with the Europeans all kind of twiddling their fingers and just not getting involved because they were too busy fighting each other. Now, one of the most important impacts of all this was that it delayed the Ottomans from invading Italy, Remember what we said earlier about Albania's geography. It's only 50 miles from Italy across the Adriatic. It's the closest place, and it is the place where the Ottomans wanted to launch their attacks into Italy. And Mehmed II, who was the Sultan who was doing a lot of the fighting against the Albanians, he had styled himself as the new Roman Empire after taking Constantinople, and he had dreams of rebuilding the Ottoman Empire as this Roman Empire in a Muslim fashion. And so we can be sure that he wanted Italy badly so that he could take over Rome and really have a good claim at being the Roman emperor. But because of this stubborn rebellion on the part of the Albanians, he didn't actually get it conquered until after Scanderbeg's death. And by that time, Mehmed II died just into the first campaign season in Italy. Mehmed's death caused a shortish civil war, and by the time everything settled down, the city the Ottomans had taken in Italy had already been retaken by the Italians. The new Sultan was not really interested in Italy, and so he scrapped this Italian invasion and instead decided to shore up what his father had taken. If the Ottomans had been able to get Albania pacified 10 years earlier, or 15 years earlier, or even 25 years earlier when Scanderbeg was first coming on into power, it would have given Mehmed and or his father plenty of time to launch a sustained Italian campaign. And that might have changed the face of Europe. Now, a second big impact was what this podcast is about, is the drawing together of the Albanian national identity. I've never been to Albania, but from what I've researched, it seems that their national identity is very strong. Now, Albanians, they have a wide range of religions, a wide range of ethnicities from being in the Ottoman Empire and then afterwards, but it seems like all of them see themselves as Albanians first and these other things second. And they all see Scanderbeg as this kind of ancient founding father. Remember, their national flag is his family's coat of arms. So even though all these victories by Scanderbeg did not lead to an Albanian nation being formed, it actually didn't form until basically the 1900s when it got its real independence. They do see him as the father of their country and their culture. There were many other things that happened during Scanderbeg's reign. His fighting with the nobles, his fighting even with some of his family members who defected to the Ottomans. We just don't have time to get into all that. If you want more info on him, please shoot me an email at info@lang4life.com, or you can chat with me on the chat box at the podcast website, www.lang4life.com/founders. Now, there are also some episodes on Scanderbeg throughout the podcast world and on YouTube. So the Bulgarian History podcast actually has a lot of stuff on Scanderbeg, starting in episode 60 and moving up into episode 67, where there's basically a recap of everything he did. Then episodes 68 and 69 tell the story of what happened after he died. There's also another podcast called The Anthology of Heroes, which is a new podcast similar to this one. And they have a podcast on Scanderbeg as well. On YouTube, if you look up Scanderbeg, you can find some pretty good videos on him there. So if you want to know more about him, you could definitely check those out. Now, at the end of each episode, I'll likely have some sort of my thoughts on what I learned from this person and or some stuff that I couldn't fit into the main episode. So I'm going to have both those for Scanderbeg because there was so much here that I've learned. If you're just here for the straight history, then you can head on out. Otherwise, I'll be happy to see you next time. Goodbye. So what did I learn from all this? I think Scanderbeg was kind of a master at having good intel. In whatever situation he wanted to win in, he was going to get good intel. So I think we can really apply that in our daily lives, right? If we're in an office or we're on an actual battlefield or just trying to fight ourselves over something that we don't want to keep doing or some bad habit, knowing your enemy and knowing yourself is crucial. It's so important to be able to size up your enemy and to size up your capabilities so that you can make good plans. And Scanderbeg was just a master at knowing his own and his enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and he was able to leverage this probably as good as maybe anyone's done before. The other thing that really helped him to actually be able to use the information that he gathered and his understanding of the strengths and weaknesses was that he was willing to think outside the box. He didn't feel the need to stick to tradition. So when he first took over, his country was basically a loose confederation of lords and families, and he turned it into a centralized modern state for the time by appealing to the peasants rather than the lords. That's quite a change from what they had before. The other thing is kind of this idea, of fighting a real pitched battle. He was just not interested in doing that because of part one here. He knew the weaknesses and the strengths of his army and the Ottoman army, and he knew that a pitched battle was just not going to go well. So he basically made his living for 25 years off of ambushes and deception. He played the hand that he was dealt expertly. Whether you're opening a startup, or you're trying to get noticed by a big company, or whatever it is that you're starting, you're always going to start off as the little guy, and you've just got to be able to think outside the box to solve problems that the big guys can't solve. And if you can do that, you're definitely going to get noticed, and you're going to be able to make progress in whatever you do. So I think Scanderbeg really is a good example of both those things. The last thing I'm going to do here is kind of this list of stuff that I didn't want to include in the main episode because it's kind of a long list of numbers. But if you like those kind of things and you like butchered Albanian city names or town names, you're welcome to stay and listen to them because I thought it was pretty interesting. I'm not even going to say which side was which because you'll know by the numbers which side was which, and the victories and losses, that kind of stuff will be, of course, from the Albanians' point of view. So here we go. In 1444, the first battle at Torvial, 40,000 versus 10,000, a victory. Mokra, 9,000 to 15,000 versus 3,500, a victory. Otanet, 15,000 versus 5,000, a decisive victory. 1448, Svetigrad, 80,000 versus 10,000, a loss. The fort was taken, but the Ottomans had 20,000 killed. Oranik, 15,000 versus 6,000, a victory. First Kruge, 80,000 to 100,000 versus 10,000, that eventual decisive victory that we talked about. Modric and Mehmed, 25,000 versus 10,000, a victory. 1453, Polog, 14,000 versus an unknown number of Albanians, a victory for the Albanians. Berat, 28,000 versus 15,000. They didn't take the fort, so definitely was not a victory there. The Albanians were trying to take a fort from the Ottomans, but they did inflict heavy casualties on the Ottomans. Second Oranik, 15,000 versus 10,000, victory. Albolena, 50,000 to 80,000 versus 10,000, another overwhelming victory with over half the enemy killed or captured. Second Mokra, 23,000 versus 8,000, a victory. In 1463, the Second Macedonian campaign, 40,000 versus an unknown number of Albanians, a decisive victory. Ohrid, 14,000 versus 10,000, another decisive victory with over 2/3 of the enemy force killed or captured. 1465, at Baikal, there was an uncertain number of Ottomans versus about 5,000 Albanians, a victory. Second Mehmed, a victory. Second Baikal and Kashari, 40,000 in two separate armies versus one 10,000-man army, two victories there. Second Kruge, 50,000 or so versus 13,000 or so, a victory. And then 1467, the third siege of Kruge, unknown, but again a very large army versus a small one, and another victory for the Albanians and Scanderbeg. So that's that 650,000 Ottoman forces all there versus those perpetually outnumbered Albanian armies. So that is all she wrote. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to go to www.langforlife.com/founders if you want to talk more about this or you have any questions. I'm always happy to discuss this stuff. Thank you.